أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين، والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه تبارك وتعالى في محكم كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لقد أنزلنا إليكم كتابا فيه ذكركم أفلا تعقلون. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. The theme of our discussion is self-awareness, self-understanding. And the first subject that we have taken under this rubric, under this heading of self-understanding, is freedom. Last night we discussed freedom of the body, which is one of the three types of freedom, the other two types being freedom of the mind and freedom of the spirit or of the soul. Tonight, inshallah, we want to discuss the second type of freedom, which is freedom of the mind. Of course, when we say mind, we mean the aql. And the word aql has been translated as intellect also. So before we start our discussion on freedom of the mind, we need to understand what is al-aql, what is the mind, what is the intellect. When we look at the ahadith of the infallible ma'sumin alayhim salam, we find that aql has been defined as, in some narrations, the first thing that Allah Azza wa Jal created. أول ما خلق الله العقل. In another narration, somebody comes to our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, and asks, Yabna Rasulillah, mal aql? O grandson of the Holy Prophet, what is aql? And he replies, ما عبد به الرحمن واكتسب به الجنان. Aql, the intellect, the mind, is that thing through which we worship Allah and through which we acquire paradise, we acquire Jannah. So this companion continues in the same hadith. He asks the Imam, فَالَّذِي كَانَ فِي مُعَاوِيَةٍ. What about that which was in Muawiyah? Because as you know, in Islamic history, Muawiyah is known as being a very cunning person. So he asked the sixth Imam, what about that which is in Muawiyah? So the Imam replies, تِلْكَ النَّكْرَى وَتِلْكَ الشَّيْطَنَةِ وَهِيَ شَبِيهَةٌ بِالْعَقْلِ وَلَيْسَتْ بِعَقْلٍ. That is cunning, that is nakra, that is shaytana, and it is very similar to aql, but it is not aql. And from this narration of our Imam, we learn that aql, the intellect, the mind, is something positive. It is something that takes one closer to Allah. It is something through which you can earn the pleasure of Allah, through which you can worship Allah. The cunning that is there in people through which they swindle one another, although sometimes we may refer to it as intellect, but that is not intellect according to the teachings of Islam. And when we start talking about the mind and about the intellect, one of the fundamental discussions that come up is the question of whether when we are born, we have something in our minds, we have some capabilities, we have some knowledge or not. In Surah An-Nahl, ayah number 78, Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَاللَّهُ أَخْرَجَكُم مِّن بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ شَيْئًا وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. Allah Azza wa Jal, when He takes you out of the wombs of your mothers, you do not know anything. لَا تَعْلَمُونَ شَيْئًا. And then He gives you the power of hearing, of sight, of contemplation, so that you may be thankful to Him. And through these senses, you are able to gain your knowledge. So if we are to look at this ayah of the Quran, we will answer that human beings are born without any knowledge. However, this is only one side of the story. When we look at Surah Ash-Shams, we find that there is something else. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. We may be born without knowledge, but we have inside us, inside our minds, a gauge through which we can differentiate between what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong. That is inbuilt, that is hard-coded, that is, as the IT specialist would say, in the hardware of human beings, not in the software. We are born with it, the ability to tell what is right and what is wrong. Now this discussion has been there amongst philosophers from time immemorial. One of the very famous philosophers, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, has a very interesting story in his book, The Republic, the second volume of The Republic. This story is about the ring of Gyges. The legend goes that there was a shepherd who was tending to a flock of sheep. His name was Gyges. One day, while he was tending to his flock of sheep, an earthquake came about. And due to that earthquake, there was a cave that opened up in the mountainside. So Gyges goes inside the cave and he finds a tomb. Inside the tomb is the body of a human being, but that human being is bigger in size than ordinary human beings. And on his finger is a ring. So Gyges takes out the ring and he puts it in his finger, and as he is adjusting it, he finds that by adjusting this ring, he becomes invisible. This is Plato in his Republic. He is giving us this story. The ring of invisibility. Now, what does he do? Using this ring of invisibility, he becomes closer to the king. And then he seduces the queen. And then he kills the king and becomes the king. And then Plato asks the question, if indeed human beings are hard-coded with knowledge of good and evil, then why is it that when we are in a position where nobody can see us, we tend to do evil without worrying about the consequences? It is only when we are under the spotlight, it is only when we are in the masjid, it is only when we are in front of others that we behave ourselves. When we are alone, where does that gauge of morality go? And then Plato answers the question and he says, no. This person did this because he was a slave to his desires. It does not mean that he did not know right from wrong. It does not mean that right and wrong are social constructs. That whatever the community you are born in deems to be right, you take it to be right. And whatever the community thinks is wrong, you take to be wrong. No. There is inside each and every one of us that gauge, that differentiates between what is right and what is wrong. Now let us come to our question of discussion, and that is freedom of the mind. What do you mean when you say freedom of the mind? There are two possible interpretations for the phrase freedom of the mind. The first is freedom to think and reason and come up with your own conclusions regarding any matter that you see fit. And the second is freedom from control and from external influence. Now let's look at the first part, which is freedom to reason out on your own and come up with your own conclusions. It's quite interesting. Many of us think the way the community wants us to think. And we do not think the way an independent and free mind would think. We think like the old man and his son in that famous story of the old man, his son, and the donkey, which I'm sure you have heard numerous times, where an old man and his son are walking with their donkey, and they pass by a group of people who begin laughing at them. And they say, look at this old man and his son, they have such a healthy donkey. But none of them are using the donkey, none of them are riding the donkey. So the father tells his son, why don't you sit on the donkey so that we may not be the object of other people's jokes. As the father is holding the donkey and the son sitting on the donkey, and they pass another group of people, they also start laughing. And they say, look at this son and this father. The son has no respect for his father. The old man is walking and the son is sitting nicely on the donkey. And so they switch places and the father comes to sit the donkey. After some time, again, another group of people begin laughing at them. And they say, look at this old father. He doesn't care about his young son. He thinks he's old so that he can just take advantage of his son. His son is so tired. So they see no option but to sit together on the donkey. And as they are both riding the donkey, now thinking that finally we will be safe from the views of the population, the views of the people, they come across another group of people who start saying, poor donkey. Two people riding on this donkey. And so they end up carrying the donkey. And this is the situation when it comes to the way we think. However, when we talk of freedom of the mind, meaning that you have freedom to think and reach your own conclusions, there are certain things that you must keep in mind. Number one, the mind is limited in its ability. Never ever think that with your mind you can reach all the answers. No. A group of people come to the Holy Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. And they ask him about the soul. And the verse comes down, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the soul. Tell them that the soul is something beyond the grasp and the comprehension of your minds. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You have been given very little knowledge. You cannot grasp this reality. How many times have we been told about the believers, الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ? What is ghaib? Ghaib is that thing which is beyond our senses, yet we believe in it. And therefore, the first and very important thing we keep in mind when we talk about freedom to reason and come to our own conclusions is that we should always remember that our minds are limited. We do not accept the idea that some people say that had Allah not revealed the religion of Islam, we human beings would have automatically reached these realities with our own minds. No. No. Our minds are limited. Number two, there are different kinds of knowledge. There is the textbook knowledge that you learn in schools, when you want to study religion, in Hawza, in the Madaris, textbook knowledge from your teachers. And there is a second type of knowledge, which is the experiential knowledge, the knowledge of experience, which you cannot convey to another person. Let me give you one example from my own personal experience. Many years ago, in Nairobi, there was a tragic accident that happened in which one of the mu'mineen was driving his car on a highway and there was a collision and everyone died. Now there, as here, we have our own Mayyat committee, and they are responsible for arranging the necessary arrangements for the ghusl and the dafan, kafan, etc. The man who was driving the car, the way in which his body was found after the accident was such that his head had been totally decapitated. Totally. Meaning there was no head on the body. At that time, because my father is part of this Mayyat committee, they were looking for him because the people who are there who wanted to perform the tayammum, because the way the body was, you could not do the ghusl to the body. You had to do tayammum. And my father was not there, so they called me. All the people who were there at that time knew how to perform that tayammum, and they all had many years of experience. And I did not know. And they asked me, please do the tayammum for us, which was surprising for me, because number one, they are people with many years of experience. Number two, they know the ahkam. Number three, they do this work all the time. But apparently, the state of the body was such that everybody in that room was unwilling to touch that body for some reason or the other. So they called me. I told them, I don't know the ahkam, I'll have to check. They said, no, we know the ahkam. Even the alim, the resident alim at the time was present. He said, I will myself show you what to do. You just do it for us. So these 8, 9 people were standing around me, giving me the instructions, and I performed the tayammum on that dead body which had no head. Now, this is an experience that has been engraved in my mind and in my heart, which no matter how many times I tell you and no matter how much you imagine, you will never get that experience and that experiential knowledge, because that is an experience. You will never feel the way I felt. You will never be impacted the way I was impacted. This is an example of experiential knowledge. Now, we are usually always concerned with textbook knowledge. We think always that everything there is to be learnt is there in the books, is there from the scholars, from the ulama, from the dhakirin. This is not the case. Sometimes certain things are beyond that kind of knowledge. So that is the second point. When we talk about freedom of mind, don't think that you can learn everything. You cannot learn everything. The third thing is that those people who usually think in terms of freedom to try and reason out and come to their own conclusions, they open the Quran and they read the ayat and they deduce for themselves. They open the hadith and they read the hadith and they come up with their own conclusions. Many of them suffer from what we term as compound ignorance. What is compound ignorance? Compound ignorance is where a person doesn't know, but they don't know that they don't know. Meaning that they think that they know. The Arabs have a very beautiful sentence. They say, إن كنت لا تدري فتلك مصيبة وإن كنت تدري فالمصيبة أعظم. If you don't know, then indeed that is a musibah. But if you know, then the musibah is even greater, because now you think you know. إن كنت لا تدري فتلك مصيبة وإن كنت تدري فالمصيبة أعظم. This is that compound ignorance. We think that we know. There is no humility. This is the third thing that we need to be aware of when we talk about that first type of freedom, which is the freedom to reason out and to deduce on our own. The fourth thing that we need to keep in mind is that many of those who want to deduce on their own are very quick to jump to conclusions. They jump to the conclusions very quickly. They are hasty. Shahid Mutahari Ridwanullah alayhi gives us an interesting example of this. When he talks about one of the scholars of Iran, Ali Shari'ati, a controversial figure but a scholar in his own right, he never used to accept the authenticity of dua and nudba. Why? Because of the sentence in dua and nudba which says, Abi radwa am ghayriha am dhi tuwa. Oh, you are addressing the Imam. Oh Imam, oh 12th Imam, where are you? Are you in Radwa? Or are you in any other place? Are you in dhi tuwa? And when Shari'ati read in history that Radwa is the name of that mountain, where the Kaysaniya, which is one of the sects of Islam in the early days, believed that Muhammad ibn Hanafiya was alive and he was living in Radwa inside that mountain, protected by 2 lions, and he will be there and he is the Mahdi and he will come out just before the day of Qiyamah. So because the Kaysaniya believed this, and he found the same name Radwa in Dua and Nudba, Ali Shari'ati said, I doubt the authenticity of Dua and Nudba. But in response, one of the great scholars of Hadith, Allama Tustari Ridwanullah alayhi, responded to Ali Shari'ati, and he said, no, Radwa has been mentioned in the Hadith even before the time of Muhammad Hanafiya. So it is not because you find the name Radwa, so you quickly jump to the conclusion that the dua is inauthentic. No. And therefore, the fourth thing that people who want to deduce their own conclusions should be aware of is that you should not jump to conclusions quickly. You should ask the scholars, you should take your time, and then come to your own conclusions. Indeed, we are all for the idea of individuals doing their own research and coming to their own understanding. Because when we look at the concept of doubt, we find that doubt is something that Allah Azza wa Jal has given to us as a blessing. If it is used correctly, when we doubt and then research and then understand, then our faith becomes stronger. Our iman becomes stronger. So we are not trying to advocate the idea that everyone should remain as they are without their own research and only ask scholars. No. We should all read, we should all do our research. But we should be wary of these pitfalls that may come in the way of your own conclusions. And that is why when we look at some of these reverts, converts who come to Islam, their iman is astoundingly stronger than some of our own mu'mineen who have been born into this faith. Because we have never had to question, we just follow. From the day we are born, we follow as we see others performing until the day we die. But these people had to undergo an arduous process of introspection, research, doubt, and then certainty. And that is why when you see somebody like Professor Jonathan Brown, a young man, a specialist in the field of hadith, when you see the way he defends the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, and you compare it to the way some of our own Muslim scholars bring doubt in the minds of people regarding hadith, you find there is a huge difference. How can a man who was just yesterday a Christian, now a Muslim, be so strong in his iman? Because he has undergone that process. That is with regards to the first aspect of freedom of the mind, meaning freedom to reason out on your own. Now we come to the second, which is freedom of the mind, meaning freedom from external control. They call it menticide. They call it brainwashing. In Farsi, interestingly, they have translated brainwashing literally. Shustashuye maghz, washing the brain. That's how they say it in Farsi. How do we maintain our freedom with regards to the way we think, such that we are not influenced by external sources? You know, there are many reasons why people try to control the minds of others. Those who are leaders of cults, they want their followers to follow them, so they brainwash them. Those who are in government, when they want to hide their crimes, they brainwash the people. When they want to keep the civilians in check, they brainwash the civilians. when they want to train their soldiers in the army such that they look at the enemy as being subhuman, they brainwash the soldiers. And therefore we find that this brainwashing is something that is done by different groups for different reasons. Now how do they do it? There are so many ways, and we do not have the time to go in detail. Suffice it to say, I will give you a few examples. When they target the young population, they target them from the syllabus in the schools, what they are taught in the schools. You will be surprised to see the way the Chinese teach their children about the war between China and Japan, and the way the Japanese teach their children. For the Japanese, they have war heroes. For the Chinese, they have war criminals. These are just examples. In America, they teach the children how the extermination of the entire, or almost the entire, native indigenous population happened, who are known as Red Indians because Columbus thought he landed in India. How did they exterminate these Indians, these Red Indians? They tell the children in the schools that it was because of disease. Because when the Europeans came, they brought some diseases, and these Native American Indians couldn't tolerate the disease, and therefore millions died because of the disease. Failing to mention the fact that millions died because they were killed. This is one example. And so when we look at this social engineering that takes place where the children are fed misinformation from a young age, this is how you change the way people think. Another thing that they use is the mass media. News networks bombard the people with information in a way in which they want to present it, until the people eventually start believing it. And that is why you will never find in the West media that talks positively about Islam. It is rare to find in the West very fair news presentation. Why? Because they have to ensure that their people are all brainwashed. And the third way in which they brainwash people these days is using the entertainment industry, using Hollywood, for example, where they make films like the recent film they made about Iran, Argo. They say based on factual events, so you think it's fact. It's not fact. Even according to their own history, it's not fact. And we, because we do not read, we are a community that does not take time to read history. When we see these movies, we take the information for fact. Just a month ago, Hollywood released a new movie by the name of The Purge. Nowadays in the Hausa, the ulama look out for some movies that are released by Hollywood that have certain underlying meanings, and then they come and discuss. Because we know that when you go out to the population, when you go to do tabligh, many of the people you encounter, especially the youth, watch these movies and they have questions in their minds, so they discuss. This movie that was released just a month ago by the name of The Purge tells us of an idea that in the future in America, in order to counter the problem of growing crime, the problem of insecurity, etc., they keep one day in the year known as the Purge. And on that one day, every citizen is allowed to commit any crime they want without any punishment. So you purge the evil inside you. You bottle up the evil for 1 year, and then you get one day. The siren goes off, you can kill, you can loot, you can steal. And when the siren goes off again, you're back to normal. And they say because of this now, everything has gone back to normal, there's no crime, there's nothing. This is one of the ideas that they present, and this is the way they indoctrinate people. And finally, using intoxication in the form of drugs. This is something very common. Nowadays, if you go to Canada, for example, you find the natives are all drug addicts. Why? Because they purposely give them drugs so that they don't claim their rights, their ancestral land. They don't claim it. The African Americans have been pushed into drugs so that they don't claim reparations for the damages that happened to them during the slavery that took place, the period of slavery. And in 1841 and 42, the infamous Opium Wars that took place. The Chinese were given so much opium that the people started becoming zombies. They were like zombies. And when China said, we won't allow you to give us any more opium, the British came with their guns blaring. You must allow us to sell you the opium so that you can remain zombies and you can remain dead and you can remain negligent. And in these ways, we find that there is external influence that tries to rob us of the freedom of our minds. And therefore, we must always be careful. We must always be aware. We must always be awake. We must ensure that we have the freedom of our minds. Let us not be amongst those who are dead while they are alive, who are asleep while they are alive. And then when they die, then فَبَصَرُكَ الْيَوْمَ حَدِيدٌ. That day there will be no benefit for you, because now you will see the truth, but it will be too late. Let us pray to Allah Azza wa Jal to grant us the tawfiq and the ability to maintain our freedom, the freedom of our bodies, the freedom of our minds, and the freedom of our hearts and spirits. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. A request has been made by one of the brothers who is at the moment undergoing surgery that we recite أما يجيب for his shafa inshaAllah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه